Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming along. I can hear the bing bong still going. I think we're expecting quite a lot of people for this event. And I'm really delighted that today we're going to hear from David McMenemy from Glasgow University. I'm sure many of you know David and the work he's been doing for many years. And today he's going to talk about the work he's been doing about the ethical and legal basis of library services. And I think it's no surprise we got so many people turning up to this event today in such high interest, because the whole issue of freedom for libraries to operate, freedom of expression within libraries, that seems to be a really hot one at the moment. I know we've probably all been watching with horror what's been happening in the United States and the really difficult environment many libraries are operating in there, and worrying, is that a trend that's going to come here? I think the signs are so far that there isn't that level of organised campaign around censorship within public libraries in this country, which is an enormous relief. But are there increasing challenges around individual titles happening? It's a bit difficult to tell at this moment. But it certainly seems a really important time for everybody working in libraries to understand clearly the ethical and legal and professional basis of library services, so that if challenges do come, they can respond accordingly and feel confident in making decisions and making those responses. So that's why I'm really pleased that David's talking to us today. I think he's got some really interesting insights and some really interesting information that could be really useful to you in thinking through issues locally. I'll hand over to David in a minute. We are keen as well to hear from you and what, if you have questions or comments, because there's so many people in the room and so many screens. If you could put your comments and questions in the chat box, in the chat function, then when we get to that time in the meeting, I'll troll through that and bring in people to ask their questions or make their comments. But do please comment, because getting that discussion, generating that discussion and hearing from people on the library floor, that's really so important. That's what it's all about, and I'm really keen to hear that, and I'm sure David is too. But over to you, David.
Thank you, Isabel. Let me just share the screen for you. Hoping everyone can see that okay. Is that coming through? Yeah, good.
It is.
I'll just get my own version of the slides so I can see them. Right, so as Isabel said, if folk could maybe put questions in the chat box, and I think it's probably easier if I run through the presentation first rather than stop, if that's okay for everybody, and obviously save any questions for after it, because otherwise I'll be having to check in and out of the PowerPoint, which is not good for anybody. So yeah, let me just kick off. So yeah, thanks for coming on. It's great to see so many people here. I know this is a topic that's obviously of massive importance and always has been, but it's something I think that can be immensely stressful when it happens to you. And certainly when I was in practice, we had in Glasgow libraries, we had a big filtering scandal, which was extremely stressful. So these tend to be the stories that we end up on the front pages of the newspapers about, and so it's good to have some support in it. But basically, the work I've been doing around this, I've been writing about this for quite a while, for many years, but a lot of what I'll talk about today is based on the work I did with the CILIP's research fund called the Reveal Project, which I'll touch on slightly. And the focus of that really was to look at advocacy around ethical issues in libraries and how we can be stronger in those. So yeah, just in terms of the purpose of this specific session, though, I'm going to highlight some of the key ethical challenges it faces and how our values actually give us strength to address these. Also offer some advice for how we can collectively strengthen our resilience in this area. So I've got some practical things that hopefully you could use as well. And also kind of encourage us to properly reflect on the nature of the challenges that face us in this area, because often I get the impression from a lot of professionals, especially younger professionals, that they feel that we're almost in a cultural year zero and none of this has ever happened before. And it's happened for as long as libraries have been in existence. So there's a lot of really good knowledge we can look to in the past, and I'll talk specifically about the legal case in the mid-1980s around News International in English public libraries that's actually really powerful as a tool we can use. I would encourage all the references that I don't cite in the slides themselves are available in the literature review I wrote for the Reveal project. So that's freely all downloadable, including all the training videos. So if you want to kind of fill your boots by looking at that link later on, then please do so. It's all available for you. So obviously the background context to this, there's various aspects. There's a new CILIP intellectual freedom policy and the committee that's forming for that soon. So obviously CILIP is realising how important this is as an area now as well to highlight. In terms of my own personal context as well, I've done around 15 workshops now around Reveal. And I've seen repeated feedback from those workshops. We get a lot of really good engagement and people want to come to them. And I think it's because there isn't really any space for people to engage with these issues in a way that feels safe. So in the workshops I do, we normally, I can do shorter workshops, but we normally do 2-3 hour workshops where we can actually delve into these ethical issues and dissect them and get lots of kind of interactive feedback on them. And all of this obviously plays into this culture wars world we're in at the moment, which really presents lots of thorny challenges and pitfalls for us as a profession. So it's the kind of thing that we need to be, I think, careful of, not any more than we would historically, but just be aware that there are a little bit more dangers out there for us in terms of people looking to catch us out. So that's why our ethics has to be really robust in these areas. So I won't cover all of these today, obviously, but some major current concerns around advocacy and ethics for us. Obviously, you've got, as I said, libraries as a focal point for culture wars issues, which obviously relates to things like censorship challenges and also challenges against library events. But one of the biggest issues I think we have as a profession is this debate around ethical neutrality. And I've seen this as a library school academic over the years. Increasingly, younger students are coming through who think neutrality is dead. And you see that in a lot of the literature as well. I get sent a lot of papers to review in this subject area where people assume neutrality is dead as a concept. And there's a lot of validity to the criticisms of neutrality, but the problem is that no one's told the public that, and no one's really told professions that. So we're operating in this kind of world where large chunks of the profession think we shouldn't be neutral and can't be neutral, and the public expect us to be. And that's a real problem for us that we haven't resolved yet. So as I've said in the slide there, this is yet to be resolved. It hasn't been resolved, despite some people thinking it has been. Also, issues like decolonisation, privacy, misinformation, disinformation, these are all current concerns that our advocacy has to be really robust in. I'm not going to dwell too long on the project, but the project, the real project, was really aimed at trying to advocate for library services based around core ethical values, because for me, I think a lot of the advocacy we touch on these topics in a very light way when they're actually really powerful. We're talking about human rights essentially for most of what we do, and access to information, freedom of expression. These are powerful concepts that the public understand, and it's important that we are able to articulate them in a really kind of meaningful way to the public, but also practice those ethical values as well as just talk about them. In terms of my motivation for wanting to do the project originally, it goes back to the point I was making about the workshops have really kind of proved to me that people want to engage with this stuff, but they don't get much opportunity as staff members to engage with ethical issues because they are thorny. And when you consider these are old stats, this is based on the old CILIP workforce study, but at the time 51% of the UK workforce held a professional degree, and I think that's even less now. So if you're lucky enough to go to library school who do talk about ethics and law in detail, which they don't all do, then you might be able to kind of rub up against these ideas in a meaningful way. But if you don't, where do you do it? With colleagues, perhaps? But that in itself is dangerous because you might be getting the wrong approaches to it. So really, it's about creating this space for engagement around these massive issues. And why do ethical issues matter in advocacy? Well, obviously we have got in the UK, CILIP's ethical framework is what, even if you're not a member, we should really all be trying to adhere to. It's what the government recognised body for our services. And why that matters, research has proved that the moral frame any organisation or profession has really does govern the advocacy that takes place. So the moral frame of the organisation or profession is conceptualised within things like mission statements or codes of ethics. So often, people can get really cynical about things like mission statements and codes of ethics. But when you consider that that's what the public sees from us as what we are supposed to be about, they're actually really, really important. So it's something we have to be really wary of being cynical about. And just more on ethical frames, this idea of what an ethical frame is, it's really important that and I go into this in much more detail in the lit review, so I unpack ethical theory from the higher level down to how it's applied in librarianship, down to how it's applied in CILIP's values. And it's really important, I think, for any professional to understand what ethical frames are and how people who might be on a different ethical frame for you, how you might engage with those people. And the reason for that is I cite Michael Sandel quite a lot in my lit review because he's someone who I think very highly of in terms of theory. But this expectation the public has about what we do is really important. So the general public have got a good understanding, often better than some professionals have, about what public libraries exist to do. So we're not free to pick and choose how we define the mission because the public understand public libraries pretty well. And if we are going to change that mission or tweak it or adapt it, then it's important that that we have engagement with our users. And just a quote there from Michael Sandel, which I think is really important. So he doesn't talk about libraries in his book Justice, but he talks about kind of services generally. He says, well, there's room for argument about what at any moment the mission of a law school or an army or an orchestra should be. It's not the case that just anything goes. Certain goods are appropriate to certain social institutions, and to ignore these goods in allocating roles can be a kind of corruption. So one of the things I do in more detail in the workshops is we go into real detail about what the attendees think the goods that libraries provide are. And so it's things like social goods like access to information, equity of access, intellectual freedom. These are all massively important social goods that benefit society. And these are the things that we always have to kind of make sure that we're building our services around. And just more from Sandel, he says the proper mission of social institutions, whether universities, corporations, military professions, or the political community, is contested and fraught. So it's tempting to seek a basis for justice and rights that keeps its distance from those controversies. And again, that quote, Matt, is really important to me. It's powerful to me because professions really are supposed to be serving those ends. So that this idea of what the public expect from us, they know what they expect from us, and it's important that we all know that as well in a deep way. And the last point I made is really important. Our ethical principles are more than just a postcard or infographic. They underpin how we should advocate for our services. And I apologise for showing an infographic in my next slide, but it's important. In terms of ethical principles, this is what we see as a profession we exist to do. This is what we support. So it's probably one of the most public-facing documents that exist. And as a way of perhaps bringing us together as a collective, even if you're not a member, even if you don't have professional staff on board, it's still the one that's government recognised by the Crown as the way that we should be operating. So these are all massively powerful elements: human rights, equalities, public benefit, preservation, intellectual freedom, etc. And one of the things I do in the workshops, for instance, I ask attendees what they think are the most important principles, and then I ask them what they think are the most important principles from the point of view of the public. And almost at every single occasion I've done this, the answer is the same. So the professionals always say human rights, and when I ask them what they think the public thinks important, it's preservation of access to knowledge. So again, you've got this slight difference between what we think we exist to do as a priority versus what we know or think the public think we do. So these kind of tensions, I think, are at the heart of a lot of the issues that we face as a profession. So as I say, that's pretty much more or less just a little snapshot of what I cover in the lit review. There's a lot more in it, but I want you to actually spend a lot of today talking about solutions. So please do please do read the review materials if you want much more depth in all the things I've talked about. Again, in great detail. It's 30,000 words. So please do dive into that. But I want to talk about solutions in terms of ways we can do this, and I'll extract a couple more things from the review, lit review for you in that way. So how can we be more ready for these ethical controversies? So a tool I found really useful, and I discuss it, unpack it in great detail in the lit review, is this scale of resistance tool, which is in a book on advocacy by Ramage, Bean and Johnson. And they say, seldom will you encounter an issue in which the range of disagreement follows a simple line from accord to resistance. Often resistant views fall into different categories so that no single line of argument appeals to all those whose views are different from your own. You have to identify not only your audience's resistance to your ideas, but also the causes of that resistance. So they recommend this tool called Scale of Resistance, and doing this in advance of any policy change, anything you think that might be controversial, so that you know in advance what the different viewpoints on that thing will be, both positive and negative. In terms of how it looks, it's simply just a little spreadsheet. So what you do on the left, you go for accord all the way through to resistance on the far side. And I've only used a kind of 5 examples here that you might do, but you could have many of them. And what you're trying to do here is say, okay, so let's just say if we buy this book that's controversial, the people who agree with that, what's their argument going to be? What are their reasons for agreeing with it? through to those in the middle, through to those in the extreme end who might be opposed to it. And then again, in advance, you're thinking about, well, what reasons would they have to being opposed to that thing? By thinking about that in advance, you can then kind of set up your responses to that, your justifications for it. So I don't have time to go through it in detail today how I'll unpack this in the lit review, but in the lit review I unpack it around planning a drag queen story hour event and talk about the different reasons from supportive all the way through to objections to it that you could think of in advance and have your your ducks in a row essentially. Because one of the things I talk about a lot in the lit review, which I don't have time to today, is the different arguments people might put across in terms of the categories of argument. So I'll talk a little bit about one-sided arguments and undecided audiences as well. Because often I think what I see in advocacy is we're very good at preaching to the choir. So we're very good at saying to the people that we know that will agree with us, the people who think libraries are wonderful, that everything we're doing is great. And we're less good, I think, at undecided or neutral audiences. And I think we're really bad at the audiences that disagree with us. So I don't have time to get into too much detail today, but I'll focus a little bit on the neutral audience, the undecided audience, and why they're important. Because Ramage, and Johnson essentially compare them to jurors. So they're not looking, they're not down in any one side of the argument or the issue. What they want is just honest, straightforward information about what the decision is and what the policy is. So what they recommend is using the classical argument for this. So introduce your issue, problem, or cause, present the case for it, address any opposition to your issue, problem, or cause. Again, having think about those in advance, provide the proof to support your argument, and then present your conclusion. If for neutral audiences, that's normally enough. It's not going to be enough for audiences who are vehemently opposed to a title or an event or a policy. But the neutral audience is usually the biggest chunk of people, and they have to be convinced. They're not going to go with kind of basically straightforward arguments about how what you're doing is wonderful because you think it's wonderful or because you have a section of the community that supports it. That neutral audience is probably the deciding factor for you and whether you're going to get a lot of really bad pushback or support within the community. But I do get into much more detail about how to deal with audiences who are much more forceful in the lit review, which I don't really have time for today, but please do delve into the lit review. And say, if you do want a workshop on this, I can do workshops where we get into it in much more detail. But in terms of, again, controversies, I wanted to highlight the one that happened, I think was it last year, 2 years ago, in an English public library service, where gender critical books, according to the Telegraph, were hidden by tin pot censor librarians, which is quite, I quite like that. Never been called a tin pot censor before. That sounds quite fun. But basically, the synopsis of that, which I'm sure you all remember, was that gender critical books have been removed from public view as a consequence of an internal human resources matter. So I obviously was watching it from afar because I'm in Scotland, but it was interesting to me the council concerned stated that the decision to remove certain books was not a political one. And at the time I was like, yep, I know why they said that, because, and this is a really powerful thing for you, the court case related to whether you can remove library materials for political reasons it was in 1986. It was the Crown versus Ealing London Borough Council ex parte Times Newspapers Limited. It was basically News International. And what the judges said in that case was a library decision taken on purely political grounds is an unlawful abuse of power. And what was really important about this case is, I talk about a little bit in the CILIP link I just gave on the chat there. The purpose of the public library was at the heart of what the judges were using as their benchmark for this, and all based around the Public Libraries and Museums Act. So I've got a couple of little snippets for you on what happened in that case. Basically what happened was, I'm just old enough to remember it. I started practice the year after it happened in 1987. But over 30 councils across the UK had decided to remove News International newspapers from the libraries for the duration of an industrial dispute. And it was a whopping dispute for those of you who are old enough to remember it. And what was interesting about it was the libraries were advised by lawyers before they did it, and also librarians not to do this. So a quote here from Mr. G. Gowdy, the QC who advised Islington Borough Council, who said, in making any judgment and exercise of its duties, the council should be guided by the library criteria only, and that other non-library considerations, however relevant to the public interest, should not be taken into account. I think that's really important. Since reading about it again, this idea of library criteria and non-library considerations, I think it again is really powerful. If we think about the purpose of a library, I think a lot of criticisms against certainly censorship challenges, etc., can be batted away by focusing on that purpose. And just some quotes there from the actual judges themselves in the case. One of the judges said, how in these circumstances can it be justifiably said that a ban of that kind is consistent with the respondent's duties under Section 7 of the Public Libraries and Museums Act, the dominant one of which is to provide a comprehensive and efficient library service for all persons, and a subordinate one to have regard to the desirability of securing that facilities are available for reference to printed matter sufficient in range to meet the general requirements and special requirements of adults. So, you know, the much lambasted Public Libraries and Museums Act actually being used as a really strong defence of intellectual freedom for libraries, massively powerful. And again, another quote from the case. Lord Justice Watkins said, I am of the opinion that the ban imposed by the respondents was for an ulterior object. It was inspired by political views which moved the respondents to interfere in industrial disputes, and for that purpose to use their powers under this Act. I would go as far as to say that no rational local authority would for a moment have thought that such a ban was open to it to impose in discharge of its duty to service libraries. So really clear here that political reason should not be influencing any stock selection choices in public libraries, and the courts basically said that. And we really shouldn't have been surprised, because even before this, in 1972, Paul O'Higgins in his book on censorship in Britain said, the legal position for libraries is fairly clear. Public libraries are not authorised to exercise a choice of the material they make available on any grounds, other than those implicit in the idea of providing an efficient library service to the particular locality in which the library is situated. So again, even at the time, we might kind of look at the Public Libraries and Museums Act now and say, oh, it's particularly weak. Well, it's not been interpreted as weak in terms of purpose and access to information and intellectual freedom. So I think it's important we go back to these sources and remember how powerful that is, because you really have a strong protection around intellectual freedom for your services. And just again, at the time, the Library Association, which was obviously the precursor to CILIP, they were very against the ban as well. They said, in our view, it's manifestly not right that councillors should allow their personal opinions on a political or industrial matter to stand in the way of the right of access of the public to all publications which it can reasonably be provided. The Library Association is deeply concerned that the imposition of these bans constitutes a major breach of the traditional principles that public libraries should be a neutral and non-partisan service. I mean, as you'll see if you read the article I posted earlier, there was a bit of disagreement in the profession in the pages of Library Information Update. Some people supported the ban, thinking it wasn't, an attack on intellectual freedom because essentially it was attacking the publisher rather than the actual item itself. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I guess I understand the logic of it. But even at the time in 1986, there was a robust debate in the pages of Library Association publications about this. So these ethical dilemmas can be thorny. They can have multiple viewpoints, but it's important to have that set of principles that we can stick to. I kind of pulled this example of a previous experience of dealing with controversial materials from Brighton Public Library in the 1960s. It's covered in Book Censorship in Public Libraries by Thompson. And this was basically Brighton's response to having people claiming that some books were, they didn't use the word triggering, but some books were offensive. And what they did was basically, in the book stamp, had this: readers are warned that there are some passages in this book which may be disturbing. 1960s trigger warnings, I guess, but really effective, because it means someone opens the first page of the book, that's what they see. So you're giving them prior warning. And it's interesting to see that a lot of TV channels use a very similar system now. So things like this, old TV channels like Rewind TV and Talking Pictures TV all have those kind of little disclaimers at the beginning of programs. So useful tactic for you if you're worried about a book perhaps that might be controversial. Get yourself a stamp like Brighton had in the 1960s. And just a little aside on library censorship, I think it's useful. At the CILIP's conference last year, we had Jamie LaRue across. He's someone actually I'd recommend if Libraries Connected are having a big conference. He's a Colorado librarian, but he used to work for ALA in their Intellectual Freedom Office, and he's a fantastic speaker. But he's written quite a lot on censorship in libraries. He's really engaging. But in his book on censorship, he was reflecting on what censorship actually is from a public perspective when they're actually trying to challenge books. And he said, in short, censorship had an emotional context. The issue wasn't really about the cultural wars or extreme political agendas. It was about the difficulty many of us have when our children cross the threshold from infancy to childhood, or childhood to adolescence and maturity. In an attempt to cope, parents went through paroxysms of anger, grief, self-righteousness, and a grasping for control. And the library was an incidental target, part of the larger problem of a world where their kids were growing up faster than their parents were ready for. I also find this passage really powerful because what it does is it encourages empathy, because quite often what you see, I think, say especially in younger professionals, I've seen this is, the automatic assumption of goodies and baddies, and someone who's objecting to a book is a bad person. Well, they might be, but equally they might be just someone who is in the kind of same category as Jamie LaRue's describing here, someone who just doesn't quite understand what the book's about, is a little bit worried about their kid being influenced negatively by something that they don't quite understand. Those people need empathy because we serve those people as well. So it's not all about saying, we're great, we're about intellectual freedom, we're going to support this regardless. Have that dialogue with them. And that's what Jamie encourages. He says, once that empathic realization is made, you can have dialogue with that person, even if it's delicate. And it involves a balance between respect, listening to the concern and giving it authentic consideration, and that against institutional purpose. And I think that Jamie really nails it here. He concludes that often entails a librarian or institution stating to the complainer that we seek to serve you well, but you're not the only one we serve. And I think for me, probably the best quote of seen so far about what a library is, that this idea of, look, we understand you don't like this, we've listened to your complaint, but other people want this item, other people want access to this. We're sorry, but that's the way it is. For me, that statement, he's put it far better than I ever could, but it's a really elegant statement. That's it. That's the purpose of what we do. And just again, touching on how library censorship has been perceived in the past, there was a major study done, Marjorie Fisk did in the 1950s in California. So obviously it's America, but I'm finding from my research very, very similar patterns. And what Marjorie did was she looked at school libraries and public libraries in California, because again, often we present censorship challenges as from the outside in. So people outside are trying to basically reduce access to information, and their goodies are the baddies as a result of that. But often what we also have is internal censorship going on. We often have staff who perhaps want certain viewpoints, often the more progressive viewpoints, to be pushed at the expense of what they see as non-progressive viewpoints. And again, this is not new. If you look at the figures on the table from Marjorie's book there, she found that a big chunk of the objectors in both school libraries and public libraries were librarians themselves, actually the biggest single number. So I hope we've got a little bit better than that in terms of statistics. But just to give you another example, we never talk about self-censorship as a profession. So I've extracted last September these stats from Library Information Science Abstracts, which is the main abstracting service for articles on our subject area. So you can see there, we really, very rarely, we talk about censorship a lot, but we never talk about our role in censorship. And I think that's really important that we're honest about that, because I think, I don't know if anyone saw the story of the National Library of Scotland yesterday, but the issue there related to an internal staff group who were advising about what should be made available. So the increasing existence of these kind of groups will influence collection development, but that is a form of self-censorship as a profession. So we just need to be really wary of these scenarios where someone will talk to us and say, well, some people might be offended by that book, this particular group won't like it. Well, libraries have always had that. That's not new. So how we address that, I think, really is fundamental to our purpose. And as I said earlier, basically since I've been doing these review workshops, I found the thing we don't talk about, that often it's staff complaints are becoming censorious for us for some services. There's an example of a library service in Scotland, which I won't name, who had a major issue with this around LGBT, gender critical stuff from LGBT groups. So again, the groups who want to do this mean well, but they're not always right. So the council concerned actually had me in to advise on it and said, well, why don't you revisit job descriptions? Why don't you consider adding things like, we adhere to CILIP's ethical principles. So I've kind of got an example on the following slide. Services could easily place CILIP's principles at the heart of every job description, which provides expectations for staff. But the most important thing for me, aside from that, from a management point of view for you, is if you've ever experienced these kind of discussions with staff, they probably, I would imagine, take time. They're probably quite stressful. You're probably worried about pile-ons. If you've got a job description that states we adhere to these 7 ethical principles, that's a 30-second conversation. It's done. But it's done for the right reasons, because it's done on the basis of what the professional body says we should do. But equally, you could put it in your mission statement as well if they're worth reevaluating. Because the problem we have is, if you've got several hundred public library services all doing their own thing, why are we all doing our own thing? Why not just adhere to the collective values we have as a profession? It's what the public see, then why don't we take that on as what we do as a purpose for ourselves as well? They are powerful and they should be collected, so why don't we use them? Almost done, but just kind of again touching a little bit on meetings and events, because I know that can be a controversial thing as well. And again, just reminding us that meetings and events in libraries should be treated exactly the same as we do for materials. The key principle, as CILIP said in their great Managing Safe and Inclusive Public Library Services document, says the key principle is that events and activities that take place in the library space, whether physical or online, and should reflect and reinforce the values and ethos which underpin the library itself. And again, ALA, library initiative programmes support the mission of the library by providing users with additional opportunities for information, education and recreation. So again, using the same principles about access to information, access to ideas, that can just as well underpin your response to event challenges as it can to material challenges. And yeah, just finishing off really a bit, I've been doing a lot of workshops, as I say, in Scotland. I'm doing one for the Public Library Users Group in Doncaster next month as well, for a couple of hours. In Scotland, I did them completely gratis, including travel expenses. But if you wanted a workshop in any English authority, I'm happy to do them. Just pay my expenses, and I wouldn't charge for doing them. But it would be at least 2 hours or half a day if you were able to free your staff up for it. It is better doing it physically because I can use interactive tools like Slido, where we can kind of get people to anonymously give their views and not have anyone feeling they can't express their views on these issues, because that's one of the, I think the thorny aspects of this is that people don't feel comfortable talking about it. So I deliberately make the workshops open, completely inclusive, with no one having to talk about these things in person. They just basically put it all into Slido and we can get it appearing on the screen and discuss what the issues are. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had in the 30 minutes I wanted to talk to you. So please do visit the review website, download all the materials, look at the videos, and hopefully they're useful. And I say if you do want a workshop, please do ask me. I'm happy to do that for you. And I will stop sharing, I think, so I can see everybody. That should have been done, I think, in about.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm very glad that you're sharing the slides, because I found myself scribbling down so many notes.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think we're going to share them actually. So they
yeah,
be shared.
No, that's
so yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because there's so much in your slides, so much thought-provoking material. I think I was especially interested in the slides about how censorship isn't anything new, and also that issue about sort of self-censorship, if you like, and debates amongst staff. I don't think we've got any anything in the chat yet. Any questions coming through? I think everyone's stunned into silence. I'm sure there'll be some popping up in a minute. Oh, Becky, you've got your hand up.
Well, I had a question, so I thought I could start.
Brilliant.
While other people then get a chance to pop their questions into the chat, if that's okay. So, David, you gave us an example of how you might put an advisory notice in a print book, but I was wondering how libraries could convert that into the digital context, based on that they could also get kind of challenges coming from their digital collections, and how, you know, they might not have so much controls over the, you know, you can't necessarily stamp a book. So what advice would you have for that kind of scenario?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Becky. I'm not as au fait with the ebook vendors as all of you will be, but do you have any control of what you can add to the content on those pages that they provide? Because the obvious place would be on the page before you download it, perhaps just having a similar disclaimer, just a similar warning. I mean, I used to be kind of very cynical about trigger warnings, but the older I get, actually, you know what, they're just polite, you know, so it gives people the opt-out of not reading it. I mean, there's certain things that trigger me. Animal cruelty triggers me, so I don't want to, if I stumble onto a TV show and it's got animal cruelty in it, I get really upset. So, in similar with social media. So I think trigger warnings are perfectly valid as long as it's not about removing it for everyone who wants to see it. So I would say, yeah, if you have some kind of control over being able to add something into the entry, but if not, you know, it's hard to do a broader disclaimer when people might find it by accident. Yeah, I mean that not knowing enough about the ebook vendors, Becky, I'm not quite sure how you would accomplish that. But I guess, do you do collective agreements now for a lot of these things? Maybe it could be something that Libraries Connected could negotiate with vendors about, perhaps, to put on books whenever there's a controversial issue, maybe having entered on the apps or having entered on the entry records for each of the books concerned. Maybe that would be the way to do it.
That's something we could feed into the e-licensing, Isabel.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I suppose it's interesting, isn't it? Because even the act of deciding which books should have trigger warnings or not could be quite controversial.
Yeah.
And we've had, it's been quite a lot of discussion around classics children's literature. Cases where books have got language that we would deem really inappropriate now. Or I loved reading What Katie Did when I was a child, but even as I read it, I was aware that it had 19th century sexist attitudes.
Yeah.
So I suppose even putting it's fascinating, isn't it? Even the act of putting a trigger warning might have some controversy.
Absolutely. Again, it's just about empathy. So I used to be more cynical about it when there was a lot of cynicism about it. But I was doing a class last year for archive students up here, and it was on the sexual abuse inquiry in Scotland that's happening at the moment. And I went into the ethics of it and stuff like that, but it didn't even occur to me before I did it, and it should have. Obviously, there might be some people in the class who had experienced that. So even talking about the phrase itself triggered people. So the next time I do it, because someone actually did mention after the class. So the next time I do it, so it's about empathy, isn't it? It's about trying just understanding that you're not removing an item by being empathetic towards somebody. If you know there's something in the book that might be controversial, I'm okay with it as long as you're not removing the book. People can make fun of it and be cynical about it and whatever, but if a book was written in a different period and maybe it doesn't quite satisfy the mores of the moment, if that gets around removing it, I would say that's an excellent trade-off personally.
I think Radio 4 Extra sometimes does it quite well. It says this comedy show was made in the 60s. I can't remember exactly what they say. Basically saying so some of the attitudes may be a bit out of date. So
absolutely. Yeah, because the flip side of this, of course, as well, is that we remove access to stuff that's come before, and I think that wouldn't be right. So no harm in telling people, look, your values are probably a little bit different from this, but there's still value in this as a piece of art or a piece of literature. I think that matters for us as a profession, that we maintain that integrity. And I say the way the TV channels do it works well from what I've seen. I'm a big fan of Talking Pictures TV. They do it really well. Literally, disclaimer at the front. First thing you see, and then it vanishes within about 30 seconds.
I'll bring Sue Minter in here because she says a youth panel sort about trigger warnings. Sue, do you want to come in and say a bit more about that work? Sounds interesting.
Yes, so we have a youth panel who advise us on things, suggest things, create things, and so on. And they are really keen on the idea of trigger warnings, but we're part of a consortium. We can't the level of effort to put that together is beyond our means. And we still have our staff selecting our stock. So when you scale that out to supplier selection, it would just be insurmountable. But the conversation that we've had with the youth panel is that role perhaps sits with the publishers, and what the youth panel can do is support us to campaign that they take ownership of that, because they're the ones who know the detail of what's inside the books.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks, Sue. Really interesting. Okay, so moving on. Jocelyn says, I think she agrees with what you're saying, Sue. She wouldn't feel comfortable adding a trigger warning to text I hadn't read myself. So the publishers then provide a universal approach, which sounds very sensible.
I mean, again, that's where the collective thing comes in, isn't it? As a profession, we have good relationships with publishers. Maybe that's how we do it, rather than individual libraries having to do it. We collectively do it, because we do have massive influence. Publishers might be a little bit wary about doing it, but I think if it helps everybody, that's a good thing.
Great. Okay, I'll bring in Jill now. Jill, do you want to ask your question? Jill Terrell.
Oh, thanks, Isabel. Hi, I just thought I'd read it out. But hello, David. Nice to see you. Really interesting and thought-provoking. I do remember some of that case law you were talking about, in particular arguing for the right for American Psychos to stay on the shelf in the early 90s, Satanic Verses. There was we had people burning books outside libraries in the late 80s, and librarians defending that position hot off the back of your 86 case law.
I remember exactly that. So actually, the only time I've ever met George Galloway, the MP, former MP, it was MP for where the Mitchell Library was. and I was actually out for my lunch when I was at work in the Mitchell Library, and he was in chatting to kind of the man who run the kind of local news agents, talking about intellectual freedom. And I have to say, he was actually really a robust defender of intellectual freedom then, because he was arguing about Sonic versus with this Muslim lad. So I was actually quite impressed by him then, not so much now. But he actually did really give a robust defence at the time of intellectual freedom.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I found all of that really interesting. You're right, we've got a long history as librarians of fighting for that non-censorship. I was quite surprised that professionals don't pick up on that impartiality and intellectual freedom more, but that's interesting. Yep. But my question is, have you got any more recent UK case law at all that is coming up? Because we've had quite a few controversial little cases. There's a few things that have come up in Kent and more recently, you know, that I'm just wondering if there's anything more recent than the 80s, which is scarily close to 1965.
No, I haven't come across anything more recent in that. I mean, obviously there was I remember the controversy around Satanic Verses. I was in practice then, and also American Psycho. Did that ever get to court for libraries perspective? I can't recall. I mean, I honestly, in England, you're kind of really well served. I don't think you need it. I think the 86 case really is it for you. Literally, a judge said non-political reasons, library. You've got everything there for you. And interestingly, that case is cited a lot in non-library materials. It's cited a lot in terms of service overreach, professional overreach. So it's a widely cited case even today around abuse of power by councils. So I think if you were ever in any position whereby any political party wanted to influence collections, point them to that, because, you know, they might still want to do it, but the judges will basically have them over toast, because it's basically entrenched in law now. It's been used quite extensively. So, it might be my ignorance. I haven't seen any other cases. I haven't come across any, but I genuinely, in England, you don't need one. You've got it. For me, if you can track down the case, I think I sent a copy to Isabel, so I probably shouldn't have from an intellectual property point of view. But it was a really hard case to track down. One of my lawyer friends at Edinburgh University tracked it down for me, so I couldn't find it. A really bad librarian, David, but a lawyer academic found it for me. It's in this obscure. It was actually, he found it in an obscure legal industrial relations journal, the transcript of it. But it's the best argument for the purpose of a public library I've ever read, and it's coming from a UK judge. So, you know, this idea, and especially when you think how badly the press is for the Public Libraries and Museums Act, to say that comprehensive and efficient thing is being used, that basically means people should have access to whatever they want. It's legal. I mean, that's amazing. A judge isn't. We're so kind of, you know, I don't know. We attack that a lot for good reasons often. But in fact, a judge has interpreted that as, you know, library's purpose is access to information. Basically, if you don't provide access to information or try to restrict it in any way for political reasons, it's an abuse of power. That's it. I
think to pick up on that, there's a really good point here from Jasmine. It's one I've been thinking about myself, where Jasmine says, the problem of not taking the actions based with politics, where's the line on that? When politicians are getting involved in things like in Kent,
yes,
it's an action or inaction political.
It's a really good point.
Want to respond. Is that no political? So I think. Yeah. Whereas,
if I may, sorry,
it's
Jasmine. Hi.
I
was just going to say, because this has been we've had some internal discussion about do we want to say anything? Are we allowed to say anything? And our managers and heads of service and all of that have said we cannot touch this. This is above the library level in the council.
Yes.
And what do you do with that?
Well, it's a really good point, Jasmine. If you look at the kind of News International case, the case was taken by 3 residents in each of the different boroughs, plus the publishers. So even then, I mean, you could argue perhaps CILIP could take a case, maybe, but ultimately it would. I think it would always involve a resident. I don't think the staff can. I think, and there's good reasons why staff can't challenge things. I think I get that. Academic freedom we have as academics, but I didn't have that when I was a practitioner, so I get it. But I think it would probably entail having a resident or a residents group take the case in terms of as happened in I think in the News International case it was. One person was a professional in the city or something, and there was a couple of other just standard residents, basically. presumably they were connected to the Tory party. I don't know. There's probably something going on there, but they were individual residents, and they basically they took the case, and so they were actually the people who were being represented in court. So yeah, I think that is probably what would need to happen.
In the case of this judgment about political, could there be some finagling over whether or not the decision was based on politics? Because I think in the Wapping newspaper case, that was clearly a political decision by those Labour councils. But in cases now where it might be a council saying, "Oh, we're not stocking that title," would then the first thing to prove that this was a political decision, and that might be quite hard to do.
Yeah, I think what was also interesting advice as well, though, you're absolutely right, Isabel, but this idea of non-library criteria or library criteria, I think that needs unpacked more. I think as a profession we could talk about that more, because again, being a kind of bit of a philosopher myself, I always go back to the word purpose. So, you know, when we kind of think about the purpose of a public library, so about free access to information, I think it is a really interesting point, though, that this word political, because a lot of people on the left, for instance, will say, well, everything's political. So that's almost like, you know, hoisting themselves on their own petard, because it pretty much means even if the left object to a book, they've automatically said it's for political reasons because that's their stated purpose. So I think the fact that they've said in court political reasons are not enough, but it wasn't just political, they stated it was a non-library reason, and they were using their power for an ulterior object. So those would probably need unpacked a little for any future cases, I would imagine. But I think there's enough in there to say that, well, the judges seem to have a really, really good understanding in that case of what public libraries were for.
Wow, that's
so it's so yeah, I think it's a good point. Probably would need to teased out in law, I would think. But I think anything, again, what they also quoted, which I didn't quote in the slides, but they also and also in the article, they also quoted the Library Association's rules on this, or principles on this, which was basically anything that's legal should be potentially made available. So you need to have a good reason for not providing something that's illegally published in the UK and a public library service that someone will want to read. So if it's published in the UK, then it's fair game potentially, and you should act in good faith around whether or not you're able to provide it or not.
Great, thank you. Yeah. We have got someone with the hand up. Sorry, Kathy Fiddler. Would you like to come in, Kathy?
Hi. Thank you so much for the session. It's been really, really helpful. I just wanted to ask, I feel like censorship, it's easy if you feel like you're on the side of current political, you know, voices. But over the last few years, it has become an issue where new members of the staff, younger members of the staff have got very strong views on certain things, and then they think they're doing it's always coming from from what they think is the right place, but it often potentially results in censorship. So, you know, should we have this book on the shelf, or we would want to promote one viewpoint but be very uncomfortable about promoting the other, which is similar to what you had in your slides. How can we support staff to understand that when we talk about censorship, we are talking about, you know, holding stock and holding viewpoints that you may vehemently disagree with, but that is our, you know, it's important that we have that balanced view.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of $64,000 question, Kathy, because it's the workshops I've done. Before I went into this, this wasn't a thing I thought was a big deal. The more sessions I do, the more I realise it is a big deal. It's why I kind of basically came up, in terms of the advice I gave the Council of Scotland, around job descriptions, put the CILIP principles in it. Because rather than having these long drawn out conversations with people about, well, I think that book's offensive, etc., that community will feel unsafe with the book, etc. These are all valid opinions to have, but they're not library reasons for not having a book. So I think I've seen it in teaching as well. Like, over the past 15 years or so, you could see a definite change in student attitudes towards this kind of thing. And I think a lot of it's happening in schools, that they're being told that certain viewpoints are no longer acceptable. Which is fine if you're not having to serve a population where half the population still have that view. So that's that utopia that we don't exist in. So for me, the solution, honestly, would be sticking in the job description. We, as a service, we expect all employees to adhere to CILIP 7 ethical principles, including intellectual freedom, etc. For me, that would get
sharing those ethical principles.
100%. Yeah, doing training on it. Some of my videos for the review project have that in it. But yeah, sharing that kind of thing is one of the things I've been trying to get CILIP to do, is unpack this stuff a lot more. Hopefully this new intellectual freedom committee will do this, because it needs much more engagement, and staff and libraries need much more support in this stuff. A lot of you are doing this on your own, and to say that the staff aspect of this, I think, is far bigger than maybe we want to collectively admit. But there are easier solutions to it. I was chatting to someone else I won't name earlier on this week who runs a library service, and he was saying, it's almost like a tyranny within it if you've got staff like that, because ultimately they are so motivated. Often there's a social media element to it as well, so you can end up with pile-on. The authority that I spoke to, for instance, for in this area, it was related to gender critical stuff, ended up getting something like 200 complaints. Now that was organised, and that started with staff. So I think there's a lot of people who want to work in libraries who shouldn't work in libraries, because obviously they want to work in libraries for things they like. But ultimately, access to information, as I said in the article I wrote, is a human right. And if you don't believe in that human rights people you don't like, then you don't really believe in human rights. And as a service, especially for your service, public libraries serve everybody. Then go back to Jamie LaRue's point: we seek to serve you well, but we also serve others. I think for me that line is just beautiful.
That is really good. I did hear an interesting thing that helped me a bit to unpack this for myself, how you live in this current situation. And they said that, you need to look at how we've managed religions in the workplace. And I found 100%. That helpful. I thought, like, belief systems are belief systems, and we can acknowledge that. We can say certain people have belief systems, and that's fine, but we've got to work together and offer many viewpoints and belief systems. So
very, very much so. But I do honestly think as a collective, if you started to look at things like job descriptions and put your expectations of staff much more upfront about these issues, I think it would really cut these conversations into tiny conversations about here's what you signed, sorry, that's it, rather than. The problem is once you open up these kind of debates, and I've had them in classes, so I get it. I've been through this in class with students, especially North American students who are even more about this. I stopped teaching intellectual freedom as a concept for 4 or 5 years because it was too dangerous. My job was at stake. I stopped doing that because I didn't think it was ethical for me to do it. But so I completely understand and empathise with all of you who are having to deal with this. So bat it away. Make the expectations of what you expect from a library assistant or a librarian, what the profession expects from a library assistant or a librarian, and what the public expects from a library. I think that if you do that, I think you'll solve a big part of the problem, in all honesty.
Brilliant, great. We've got questions flooding in now. Sort of following on from that, Clint has talked about self-censorship and leading up to the Brexit vote, and members of the public wanting information that wasn't political, but staff avoided displays, events, or overly promoting information because, of course, most sources were political or perceived, interpreted as political. So I think there is that issue of self-censorship, or also, or people feeling a bit worried about stuff, so therefore we won't do that book promotion for that whatever it is day. I think that's an issue as well.
Yeah, no, very much so. I remember actually a good example of that was, believe it or not, one of those Agatha Christie ITV dramas where there was I can't remember which one it was, but there was a library that was basically displaying, I think it was Tory party material, and basically the consensus was, well, okay, we display all parties material then, and that was it, solved. Right. You don't take sides. You basically show up all sides of an argument, and then you're covered.
Brilliant, great. Now this is an interesting one. Caroline, do you want to talk? Caroline Ray, do you want to comment about your interesting one with public health?
Hi. It feels quite minor in comparison to some of the things that we've been talking about, but yeah, public health have asked us to take books off by a particular author because they disagree with the parenting and infant feeding that's suggested by this author. I've done nothing about it at the moment, other than say, okay, well, we'll go and have a look at that. But kind of the more I listen to you, I'm just thinking, well, I'm right in not having done anything about this, because it doesn't appear to be. Someone, I think in the chat said, is this misinformation? Well, I'm assuming the publisher wouldn't be publishing it if it was misinformation, but maybe I'm over relying on the publisher to get it right. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. I mean, are the books, are they kind of cuckoo or whatever? What's the issue with them? It seems a bit of a stretch for public health to.
No, really mainstream children, a mainstream author in parenting books. But I think it's just they've said that, yeah, the current practice is not as. I guess it's maybe someone who's coming from the side of being very strict on on children and young children, and our public health are coming from the we wouldn't ever dream of doing this around infant feeding or whatever.
I mean, again, I guess I'd fall down on the side of if there's large portions of the population who want to parent in that way, they're entitled to read about it. You know, if it's a legal book, again, I mean, there's a balance has to be struck, I guess, but I don't think any government body or organisation should be influencing collections. I think that's an overreach. But I guess it is about being up to date about whether or not I mean, if they're recent books and they're being published in the UK, then the potentially fair game for access. It's whether or not you believe as an organisation that they are, as someone else posted, whether they are a bit misinformation and disinformation. But you know, things like parenting. I mean, tell people from certain religions not to parent in the way they want to parent. I mean, I'm a lapsed Catholic, so you know, so I get it. So I think that kind of overreach from a government body, I'd be uncomfortable with personally. I think your judgment as a professional and as an institution is important.
Yeah, and that was kind of, we were going from there. Well, actually, are these books borrowed? And is there actually a need for them in that sense? Is where we're going.
Very much
from.
so. Yeah.
That was it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think parenting advice that changes every 5 minutes, doesn't it? Which
exactly. Yeah.
I remember when my son was born, they just changed from don't feed them till they're 4 months till 6 months. It was just like, so yeah. But yeah, really interesting. I
guess if pushed, it's one you could put a disclaimer in. If pushed, you could say this book, based on public health advice, this book is not deemed to be as up to date as others. Maybe at a push. But if people want to read it, then tell to read it.
Yeah.
Right, I think we are just about on time now. A lot of people have had to zip off, but lots of thanks. I'll just bring finally in. I think it's Natasha from Cornwall to talk about the stickers you're putting on books. That's such an interesting approach. I don't know if Natasha's.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, yeah. One of the things we is something that we're kind of trying a little bit more with, but we're thinking absolutely not to put any sort of warnings or anything like that to discourage people, really aware that we don't want to go down that route. So we've been working with other services, and something that we've been looking at both in terms of keyword searches and also then putting in that signposting, a bit like the kind of BBC or Channel 4 of kind of if you're experiencing any of these issues, and these are some other support networks that you can kind of go down. And so it's kind of giving options of a variety of information, so that it's not us stopping them reading them, but it's giving them the kind of support. And I think that also enabling it to be a kind of responsible collection, I suppose, in a way. So where we recognise that some of the books we might not agree with the themes or the content, then it enables some potential critical thinking or an opportunity to reach out. So that's kind of fiction and non-fiction as well with some of those themes. So that's something we've been definitely looking at and working with some of the other Cornwall Council teams to do that. So the Safer Cornwall team and then our resettlement team as well. So it's about positive information rather than negative.
That sounds great. Yeah, it sounds excellent. It's a good approach.
Well, I think, we've come up to the hour. This time's flown. This has been such a fantastic session. And, you know, some people have said it's great to sort of reconnect and reground ourselves in those professional values. I think there's been some really good practical ideas and advice coming from people, as well as some of these quite mind-bending dilemmas that people are facing. So yeah, David, massive thanks. Your work and your the sort of clarity you bring to this thinking is so valuable at the moment.
That's really kind, Isabel. Thank you. Yeah. And offers open if any authorities want me to come down and do training, just give me a shout. I'm happy to do it. Just pay my expenses. That's all.
And as Caroline says, Happy Public Libraries Act.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Perfect timing for today, wasn't it?
Yeah, brilliant. But thank you, David. I'm sure loads of people will take up that offer. And if you stay on at the end, I've just had an idea about maybe something we could do together. But thank you. Sure. Really, really super interesting.
Thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you.